We talked about prayer last week. We picked up and talked a little bit about prayer with just some practical steps for prayer being a way or a portal to all of God's power that He has for us through the Holy Spirit. So the time we spend in prayer, we spend actually shaping our hearts, shaping our perspective so that we're walking in the Spirit. And even this last week, as I was reading and studying about prayer, I just did a little bit of search about how prayer affects us, how prayer just, not only affects our spirit, how it begins to shape our perspective, but even in science, as they're studying about what prayer does to the brain, I guess they attached some things to a few people's heads. And so they looked at prayer and they looked at what happens when you pray. They looked at what happens when you meditate, and there's a hypersensitivity in a certain part of your brain. It's the part that helps you to focus. And then I thought, I guess for me anyway, maybe that's why I'm having such a hard time in prayer is I have a hard time focusing. And so then as I was studying and thinking about prayer, I thought, what prayer does for me really is that it does force me to focus. It does force me to think. I can't tell you the number of times where I start to pray and within 30 seconds, I'm already way off course. I'm already way off base. I've already wandered off the reservation. And so I find myself 2, 3, 4 times during a session of prayer, a 15, 20-minute, 30-minute session of prayer, even a 5-minute session of prayer. I find myself 2 or 3 times having to refocus, having to redirect, and even say, okay, God, help me with this. Well, believe it or not, prayer can help us focus. I think being in prayer regularly can actually help us not just focus while we pray, but I think what it does for us is it creates focus in our lives. It creates a sense of purpose as we pray. The more we pray, the more that our hearts are aligned with what God has for us that day, the more aware we are of what God might be doing in our lives that day. And so in a very real sense, as I thought about prayer, I thought about the focus it brings to our lives. The sense of purpose it can bring to our lives as we're interacting with God in such a way as to be aware of all that He's doing in our lives. So prayer, I think we could go 1,000 different directions with it. And today I was going to talk a little bit about prayer from maybe a different angle. I should say that many times I'm reactive when I pray. Something happens, then I pray. And today I want to kind of shift that for us a little bit. How can we become proactive when we pray, and what would that look like for us? There's a prayer in the Bible, and I would argue that it might be, if not the shortest prayer in the Bible, one of the shortest prayers in the Bible. It's made by a man who finds himself in a bit of a crunch, and a bit of an opportunity. Except that it's on the one hand, it could be the greatest opportunity of his life, or the greatest opportunity. It could be exactly what he was destined to do. It could be exactly that kind of opportunity. And on the other hand, he's up against what could really be his death. He's going to make a request to a king, and he makes what I think is the shortest prayer in the Bible. I can't say for sure that it's the shortest prayer because we don't know what the words are. We don't really know what he said. But I think as you read with me, then you'll get the hint. You'll get the clue. You'll understand exactly what I'm talking about in terms of what you think he might have said. It's in Nehemiah chapter 2. And I want you to turn there. It'll be up on the screen too. But I want you to turn to Nehemiah chapter 2. And we're going to pick up this story at the beginning of chapter 2 where Nehemiah finds himself grieving over what's happened to his people. Now, Nehemiah is the cupbearer. We'll talk a little bit about that. But the cupbearer is the one who would take a sip and make sure that there wasn't any poison in it. No, and you know how you would know if there was poison in it. Well, the cupbearer would die or break out in hives or something really weird. I don't know what you could do to wine, but it would happen to the cupbearer first. And so he's presenting a cup to the king, but his face is sad. And so you might imagine that the king, wondering why his face or his disposition was so downcast, you might imagine that the king might think that maybe he's up to something, or maybe he knows about a plot from someone who is up to something. Well, look how it happens here in chapter 2, verse 1. It says, "In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now, I had not been sad in his presence." So leading up to this point, obviously I had not been sad. Verse 2, "And the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, seeing that you are not sick?'" You didn't die. Aren't you happy about that? "This is nothing but sadness of the heart." You must really be sad. You must be emotional about something. What's wrong? And he says, then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Then the king, and this is, we're coming right up on the prayer. Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases you, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. If you'll look at this, for me anyway, I think you can imagine, if we can go back to verse 4, leading into verse 5, can you imagine how long that prayer must have been? I mean, in my mind, I've been in situations where all I had time to do was about a 1 to 2 second prayer before I had to say something or do something. Have you ever been in that position? Have you ever been in that kind of tight spot? The king says, so, well, what do you want from me? So I prayed to heaven and I gave an answer. It's a quick prayer. It's a help me, God. It's a please, feet don't fail me now, right? It's one of those kind of statements where you're praying and you're saying, okay, here we go. God, I need your help. I'm pleading with you. Get me through this. Have you ever been in a tight spot like that? I think for me, these are times where I find myself, and that's what I meant earlier by find myself being more reactive in prayer. I find myself in a real tight spot, a predicament I didn't anticipate, and so then I pray a quick prayer like, God, help me. And when we read this, we see that if you were to read through the rest of the chapter in terms of chapter 2, you would see that the king actually ends up granting the request that Nehemiah gave. And I think if all we had was chapter 2, then we might be okay to say, hey, listen, if you get in a real pinch, just pray a quick prayer, just a one-off, and it works every time. But I don't think it's that way. I think that what happens here in this prayer is it's more reactive, it's more proactive, it's more active on his part. He's taking initiative. He has already taken initiative so that when he prays this kind of prayer, what he's doing here is building on, capitalizing on the time he has already spent in prayer, the preparation that has already been in place. That's kind of what I would like. What I think sometimes happens to us is we could go weeks and the only kinds of prayers we make are those short ones. Hey, help me with this test. Help me with this job. Help me with this transfer. Okay, God, help me with this conversation. Help me with whatever. And they're those quick ones. And I'm not saying they're bad ones. I'm just saying let's take a look at what it would take to build up to those kinds of prayers so that they're not purely reactional, so that prayers like this become part of the whole picture of our walk with God. Does that make sense? So I want us to turn a little bit away from using prayer just as a way of sort of answering those quick one-offs, those quick little one-liners that we make to God when we're in a tight spot. And what I want for us is for us to be actively praying in such a way that we're looking for opportunities like what Nehemiah has, so that when the opportunity falls, we've discovered our passion, we've been in prayer, we've already been praying, we've already been in preparation for this kind of thing. So let's talk about prayer, and let's back up to chapter 1, verse 1. And I want you to see what goes into that quick little prayer that Nehemiah makes. So join me in chapter 1, verse 1, and I'm going to read through the chapter and just make some comments here. Chapter 1, verse 1, it says, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them, look at what he's concerned about. Look at his passion here. I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. The next verse, in verse 4, it says, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying to the God of heaven. Do you see that one-off prayer really wasn't just a standalone event in Nehemiah's life? You see that he was actually passionate about God's people, passionate about God's city, Jerusalem. And even as we read his prayer, he's going to make a prayer to God. He's passionate about God's fame, about his glory, about the good news of who God is. He's passionate about all the right things. And I think one of the first points that I wanted to make is that when we make these prayers that are quick, I think sometimes we're reactive, and the best way for us to turn those prayers and to see that they become proactive, to see that they become part of what God's doing in our lives, is for us to identify a passion. For us to identify what we're passionate about. I'm passionate about teaching the word, and I'm passionate about church. And I've learned over 3.5 years of church planting that not everyone shares the same degree of passion about church or even church planting. That's my thing. That's what God's called me to do. I might ask you to even consider, what has God called you to do? Clarifying things like calling, clarifying things like passion, something that I think is a worthy endeavor. It's something good for us to dig into. So what is it that you do? What is it that you wish you could do? Some of us have occupations. And I think some of us could understand that when we talk about passion or we talk about calling, we're not just talking about one thing for the rest of your life. There might be seasons in which something is a passion of yours or something is a calling that God has given you. We see here Nehemiah was passionate about God's people, God's glory. When I think about passion, the only thing that came to my mind, or I should say the number one thing that came to mind, was love. Love. How would you describe what you love? Let's take anything that you might imagine to be an occupation. You stay at home, or you work out of the home in some way, or you work from home. Maybe you're a mechanic or an engineer, or maybe you're a designer, a graphic designer, or maybe you're a doctor, or maybe you do something else. When we talk about our passion, I think what might help us identify and even clarify passion a little bit, what might put fire back into our souls when we think about what God's called us to do, is to take it beyond the tasks that we do and think about the people that we serve. Think about how what God has called us to do and what we've become passionate about is a way of serving God himself. And then I want you to take what God has called you to do and what might be passion, if you could name something, or maybe you can't name something and you'd like to have a conversation with someone. I can put you in touch with people who really can help guide you through something like that. And I'd be glad to talk with you too. But I want you to take your passion, your thing you do with your hands, whatever, if it's something you do on the computer or something you do on the phone. And I think what happens for us is we can bump right up to things like burnout, fatigue. We can forget our calling. We can forget our passion. And you know what at times has reminded me of maybe why I'm doing this? Not just preaching, not just teaching, even things like sign language interpreting, which I do on the side. Even things like being a good dad in the home. I mean, there are times where regardless of what scenario I'm looking at, whether it's in the home or whether it's on the job or whether it's in the church or whether it's just my interaction, like on the homeowners association in our neighborhood. And I do want to quit that, and I'm going to quit that. But whatever it is, do you know what helps me just re-energize my passion for that? I don't think about the task list that I have to get done. That's always overwhelming to me. I think about the people that God's called me to serve. I think about the passion God's given me for those people or for that demographic. And I think that would be good for us, regardless of your occupation, regardless of what you do in the home. I think for all of us, we should spend time thinking about that, spend time focusing on passion. And I would say, actually, write that down. Nehemiah does this. It's called a memoir. So Nehemiah makes a memoir, and it's scripture, okay? And I'm encouraging you to do the same thing. Write down passion. Ask God for clarity in terms of calling. What's he asked you to do? What's he asking you to do just for this season? What might be 5 or 10 years out the road, and what can you be working toward? Spend some time doing that. It's a healthy thing. It's a good thing. So I want you to clarify passion. And when you've done that, I think what happens at times is once we've clarified passion, then our minds and our hearts are awakened to opportunities like Nehemiah had, where we can make good on the passion that we know God's called us to do. So that quick one-liner actually comes after we've already identified and been looking for the opportunity to do what God's called us to do. Passion's the first. Let's keep working down Nehemiah chapter 1. He says in verse 4, "As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said," here's his prayer, guys. I want you to study this prayer. We won't do that today. I want you to see that he prayed. He says in verse 5, "O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded." He's reminding God, not as though he needs it, but what he's doing is aligning himself with God's promise. He's saying, God, remember what you said. Remember your commandment, that the word that you gave to Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though you are outcasts in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place I've chosen to make my name dwell there. And then he moves into the next part of his prayer. They are your servants and your people whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. He prays at the end, in a closing, as he closes his prayer, he prays specifically for God to give him favor in the eyes of the king. He says, God, give me success. You ever feel bad praying for that? You know, sometimes I feel bad. So I'm praying, and I'm praying for the message even, or just whatever it is, but I'll use the message as an example. Do you know, sometimes when I'm praying, I'm saying, God, help me to do a good job. And I feel kind of bad for saying that. Like, it's not about you, Chris. I get that. And I think for some of us, we might feel that way, like, oh, help me do a good job. But I don't think we should sort of refrain from those kinds of prayers. I think as we make prayers, as we're praying to God, as we're seeking God, I would like for us to use the pattern that Nehemiah uses here. And I think I think that maybe some of you have heard this and maybe some of you have never heard this before, but it's an acronym, ACTS. And this is where my whiteboard would come in handy. Some of you might remember that from days gone by. So as soon as I can get a little bit of a platform here, I'm going to bring out a whiteboard and I'll use it again. So I know some of you guys are super stoked about that now. But if I had a whiteboard, what I would do is write it ACTS, and I would want you to do the same. And I want you to see what those letters stand for and see how Nehemiah prays. His prayer life is a bit intense, I think. He's praying to God. He's praying regularly. He's mourning. He's fasting. And the way we see this prayer unfold is A, for adoration. He starts by just adoring God, by worshiping him. You are the great God. You are awesome, God. Adoration. And then it moves to confession. Did you see that in his prayer? We have sinned. I and my Father, we have sinned. We are confessing our sin. I'm confessing the sin of our people. And then it moves to T for thanksgiving. And I think it's a bit of a stretch for us to say he was saying thanksgiving here, but for us we could say thanksgiving. And that's the part where he says, remember, God, remember your promises. Remember how you saved us, how you redeemed us. Remember that we are your servants. And so in a way he's thanking God, he's recognizing God. And then at the end it's S for supplication. This is where he makes his request. And his request is pretty specific, wouldn't you say? He says, God, I pray that you would help me to be successful in talking to the king, and I pray that you would give me favor in the eyes of the king. That sounds like a pretty specific prayer. That's what I kind of want to challenge us to do. I want us to have a prayer life that really is following this pattern where we begin praying and we say, God, you are wonderful, you're great. We're reminding ourselves of how good he is, and we move to confession and we turn ourselves to him. We turn ourselves away from sin and idolatry and we align ourselves with him and say, God, we confess these things. We turn to you. And from there we move into thanksgiving. We move into recognition of all that God's done. We begin to acknowledge him. And then I think we make our supplication. We make our requests. I might add one more S, a lowercase s maybe, and just ask that you make it specific. Pray for something specific, not just healing in general, but healing for that ingrown toe on my left foot. Okay, I don't have one, but it might be super specific. Pray for it. It might be a certain conversation, maybe with your boss or maybe with a coworker, and it might have the nature of being confrontational. Pray for that specific thing. I'm asking you to pray. And I'm saying that what happens here for Nehemiah is as we look at that quick one-off and we laugh about that because we've been in those tight spots before, I think rather than them just being reactionary and rather than us seeing really very little fruit from those kinds of opportunities, I think the best way to see fruit and for God to get glory out of those specific or what would otherwise be specific answers to prayer is to have prayed and mourned and fasted for days with God, to spend time in adoration, to spend time in confession, to spend time in acknowledgement and thanksgiving, and to spend time making specific supplication or requests. And I think those are, what we're doing here is creating a pathway to that prayer we saw in chapter 2 that looks funny, that looks like one we've all made when we've been in a tight spot. And I want us to turn that. I want us to see that prayer, that quick prayer as we're going into the boss's office, that quick prayer as we're walking in on something that's happening, that quick prayer as we discover that something needs to get done and it needs to happen pretty quickly. That quick prayer when we find ourselves in a tight spot. I want us to be ready for it. I want us to be ready by having identified passion and calling. I want us to be ready with ears alert by having prepared ourselves beforehand in length of prayer and time spent with God. And then another thing that I want for us is position. I want us to see the position that God had placed Nehemiah in. After he gets through praying, he says in verse 11, he says, "O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear in your name, and give them success to your servant today. Give me success and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." Now, the last part of that verse, "Now I was cupbearer to the king." Who else might you imagine would have as much access to the king as Nehemiah? Now, he's about to make a request on behalf of the people that he go and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, or that he go and rebuild the city in Jerusalem, Who else is better suited to actually make this kind of request, to have this kind of access, to have built up this kind of rapport to the king than his very own cupbearer? And I might ask you, do you think it was an accident that Nehemiah was also passionate about that, had prayed about that, and then had leveraged his position, the place that God had him? You think it was an accident? I don't think so. And I think for us in times of prayer, when we meet ourselves with an opportunity, and on one hand, it could be the greatest opportunity of our lives, and on the other hand, it could be the death of me. It could be the last thing that ever happens to me. It could be what makes the family fall apart. It could be what makes the job fall apart. It could be for you what makes your aspirations for a career in this field all just fall apart, and you're up against something and you're saying to yourself, God, help me. I think the best way to prepare for a moment like that, to get the most out of a moment like that, is to have clarified calling and passion. To have your ears alert to opportunities like that, to have spent time in prayer. And then I might even ask you to see the position that where God has placed you. For some of us, we've just considered it maybe not an accident because we are Christians, so we would understand that God has a purpose and a plan, and we kind of say that. But what I want for us is to see and to really believe walking out of here that you are placed where God has you, not by accident, but on purpose. He's placed you in that job. He's put you in that field or given you that training in that field. He's transitioning you into a new field or a new opportunity, and it's not an accident. He's placed you in Hampton Roads. And as badly as you might want to leave or as badly as you might want to stay, but God's calling you to leave, God has you where he wants you, at least for this moment. And I think it's really good for us to see that. It's really good for you to see, not just in general, that our lives are perfectly placed and on purpose, established by God exactly where he wants us. I think that's a good thing and a healthy thing to remind us. But when you find yourself in one of these kinds of predicaments, where you're up against a tight spot or up against an obstacle or a hurdle, or you've been backed into a corner, if you've got a hard conversation to make, or you've got a hard job to do, or whatever it is, but you're seeing and sensing that this is difficult, what I don't want you to do is to wish that it didn't happen or to wish that you were were somewhere else, or the wish that you didn't have to deal with that person or that thing. I want you to see it as exactly what God has planned for you, exactly what he wants you to work through. I want you to use that, leverage that for what God might want to do in your life and what God might want to do in the lives of the others around you. And that's exactly what Nehemiah does. Well, he's the cupbearer, so he leverages that for an opportunity to do exactly what God had given him to do, his passion, his calling. And then I think for us, as we think about position, I want us to categorize those. And if you're taking notes, I want you to see position and where he's placed you in these 4 categories. In the home, it's not an accident where he's placed you. It's not an accident that you're a mom or you're not a mom yet. That you're a dad, you're not a dad yet. You're single or married, not an accident. Whatever your job is, maybe you're a roommate, it's not an accident that God's placed you with that person. It may be random because you found them on Craigslist. It's not an accident. And I want us to embrace that. God has us where he wants us, in places where he wants us. And I want us to leverage those as opportunities instead of seeing them as drawbacks. And I think that's how, when we're prepared like this, I think that's how our eyes and our hearts, our ears, all of them become attuned to what God might be doing in those moments that Nehemiah had in chapter 2 as he's standing before the king and makes the quickest prayer ever. Help me. The next thing isn't just position. It's home, it's work, it's church, and it's city. Those are the 4 things I want you to actually evaluate. Where has God positioned me in the home? Where has God positioned us? And in what neighborhood has God placed us? And is it an accident that you've got grumpy neighbors next to you? Or is it an accident maybe that you've got awesome neighbors and you just happen to have awesome neighbors? Is it an accident that you're in the neighborhood or the apartment complex or wherever it is? Is that an accident? And I'd say, no, not at all. That's home, and then there's work. Is it an accident that God has you doing what he's asked you to do or what you're doing for this season? Is it an accident you found your way to Anchor Church? Is it an accident that he's gifted you in some ways and gifted others in different ways? And I'd say, no, not at all. The next thing is preparation. So he says, I was cupbearer to the king, and he leverages his position, wherever it is that God's placed him, for the opportunity to do what God called him to do. And then and read with me in chapter 2, verses 1 to 7, as we kind of bring this to a close with my last point, which is preparation. He didn't just make the prayer, help me as I talk to the king, in Jesus' name, amen, and then just say, okay, here's what I want. It didn't come without forethought. He knew his calling, knew his passion. He had spent time praying and even was praying with specificity. He had a specific prayer he was making. And not only that, he knew where God had placed him, and he was intending to leverage that access to the king, or maybe you've got access to certain demographic of people in the city. Maybe by virtue of what you do for a living, there's a certain group of people that you interact with, and none of that's an accident. He's leveraging all of those, and the last part is that he was prepared when he spoke to the king. And this is chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. Look at it here. We read it here. Actually, I want to pick up in verse 4. He says in verse 4, then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, quick prayer there, and then he says, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, specific here, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. There's his ask. Then he follows it up, and I want you to see the next 2 verses. And the king said to me, with the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. Now look at verse 7. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. So he'd already sort of seen that there might be some difficulty ahead, and he'd already prepared that if the king grants this, if this conversation happens, here's what I'm going to say. Verse 8, and give me a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's force, that he may give me timber to make the beams for the gates of the fortress to the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me, verse 8, the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. I think the last point that I had to make that I'll use to kind of close this is that when we find ourselves in predicaments like that, I think it's best for us as best we can to prepare for those kinds of things. What I mean is that I think it's good to have prepared for what God might have you to say to a certain person. It might be good for you to be prepared with what you might do or how you might react if anything happens or if it doesn't happen. I think all I'm saying is that I want us to be a people who are actively pursuing God so that we're not caught off guard by an opportunity that Nehemiah might have missed if he hadn't spent time clarifying what he was passionate about, which was God's people and God's city being rebuilt. He was passionate about that and even felt like he might have a role to play in that. If he hadn't clarified that, I think he might have missed the opportunity that came to him when the king said, "What's wrong with you?" And he might have said, "I'm just sad." All right, he may not have been prepared. So I think clarifying passion, and I think spending time in prayer with God and making specific asks to God, I think is another critical step for him, where had he not been prepared, had he not made the request to God, then I don't know if he would have been as attuned to what God was doing to possibly, he might have missed the opportunity. I don't want that for us. I think the third thing is that he was positioned in such a way as to have influence over the king. And I don't want us to forget that or just somehow to not see the neighborhood you live in as God having positioned you in a strategic location. Or the job he's given you as God having strategically placed you there for the industry, for the people you serve, and for your coworkers. I don't want to miss that opportunity. I don't want us to just kind of be going about our day, going about our weeks, going about our years, and having missed out on opportunities like this to actually capitalize on what God has called us to do, the prayers that we have made with specific requests, and not only that, but understanding our position, and then lastly, having prepared ourselves for what God might do. Do you have a friend, and when you talk to them, you just kind of wing it? What about the next time that they, have the same issue you've talked to them about for the last 3 years, 100 times? Maybe you just pray. Maybe you prepare. Maybe you see it as what God's done to position you in their lives as a way of influencing them. And you might prepare by just saying, "Look, I don't know how to minister to them, God, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to encourage them with these words. Or give me a chance to confront that. I'm kind of scared to do it. But give me a chance, give me an open opportunity, and when the opportunity comes, I'm going to be like Nehemiah and say, 'God, help me.' And then I'm going to say it, or I'm going to do it. I know that family's in need, and I know I want to help them. And so rather than just miss an opportunity because I wasn't prepared, I'm going to actually think about it. Man, is there a time this week I can prepare a meal for them? I want to prepare a meal for them. God, make it clear. If I'm in conversation with them and it comes up, give me the opportunity to say, 'Hey, I'd like to help you. Would this be a help to you?' I'm talking about just in general. I'm talking about life, and I'm talking about the fact that it's really easy for us to just go day to day in the monotonous day to day. Just to wake up, get ready for the day, go to work, spend the day doing that task list that's there waiting for you. You already know it exists. And then you get home and you unwind for the day, and then you knock out, go to sleep, and you get up the next day and you do it all over again. And I'm saying, look, our prayers, our prayer life, these opportunities that Nehemiah was presented with can be met with more than just a quick prayer, a quickie, a quick fix to the solution. We can be prepared. We can be proactive. We can be people of God on a mission, and not simply reacting to the things that happen to us. And I want us to be that way. I want us to be ferocious about God's kingdom and the advancement of His good news, so that we're proclaiming the good news and demonstrating that good news in everything we say, with everything we do. And we're actively looking for opportunities to do that. Actively looking to leverage the position that God has placed us in. Actively looking to spend time with Him in prayer and make specific requests. Actively looking to clarify purpose and calling. Maybe even actively preparing ourselves for opportunity should it present itself. So I'm closing this, this message, and as we close, I'm reminded of the prayer that Nehemiah makes, and I'm reminded of all the times where I have actually prayed, God, help me. And a lot of those times are times that I just can't prepare myself for, right? So I think some of those examples might be like walking in on your, one of your children having marked up the entire wall with multiple colors. And I might say to myself, God, help me. There's just no way to prepare yourself for that, guys. There's just no way to do it. There's no way to be prepared for something like that. But there's other, that's sort of lighthearted, I guess, but there's other opportunities that you might encounter. There's other major decisions that you guys might have to make, or that you might be in the process of making. And I want to prompt you, urge you to be proactive. What I want for us is that when we see an opportunity, that prayer that says, God, help me, I want it to have power behind it. I want it to have a sense of purpose behind it. I want us to be clear in the ask as we've been praying with God. So let's pray together, would you? As I pray, the band's going to come and lead us. Lord, thank you for this opportunity we have to spend a little bit of time talking about prayer. But for me anyway, God, this is the kind of prayer I make every Sunday. God, help me. Help me as I communicate your word. This is the kind of prayer I make when I'm having a conversation with someone, even just for coffee or for encouragement or for correction. This is the kind of prayer I make as I'm coming home from a long day to try and be a good dad, to try and be a dad who loves his kids and spends time with them, loves his wife, spends time with her. So I'm praying these quick prayers. But God, I pray that I would be proactive. I would be an example and a model here for us as a church, and that we would be an example and a model to those people in areas of influence, whether it's at work or in the neighborhood or at school. God, may we live with passion. May we live with a clear purpose to love God, to serve Him, to love others, and to find ways to serve them. God, I pray that we'd be people of prayer, regular prayer, extended times of prayer. God, I pray that we would see that where we're positioned is not at all an accident. And God, I pray that you'd prepare us for what lies ahead. We may not even realize that the conversations we're having now, the job that we're in now, the relationships that we're building now, we may have no idea how those things are preparing us. But God, I pray that we would have that perspective to see everything that's happening, to see every opportunity and every obstacle as you preparing us for what you've called us to do. So change our perspective. Give us a sense of purpose and mission, Lord, and use us, God, for what you intend to do in our lives. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.